The figure known throughout history as King Henry III was born on the first day of October in the year 1207, within the confines of Winchester Castle, situated in Hampshire, a county in the southeastern region of England. He is often referred to as Henry of Winchester, a designation referencing his place of birth at this esteemed royal residence. His father was King John I of England, who had presided over the country since the year 1199. John had inherited extensive territories beyond the borders of England, encompassing lands in France and Ireland. However, as will be elaborated upon subsequently, owing to his ineffective governance, the entity that has been termed the Angevin Empire, forged by the 12th century English monarchs, was demonstrably in a state of decline by the commencement of the 13th century. Henry's mother was Queen Isabella of Angoulême. She had entered into matrimony with John in the year 1200. While still in her youthful teenage years, and it is plausible that her relative youth contributed to the marriage remaining childless until the arrival of Henry 7 years later. He would be the first in a sequence of 5 children born in rapid succession. Henry's younger brother Richard was born in January of 1209, followed by 3 daughters, Joan, Isabella, and Eleanor, who were born in 1210, 1214, and 1215, respectively. Limited details are available concerning Henry's earliest years. He was nurtured under the care of his mother and a wet nurse by the name of Ellen Dunn, to whom he subsequently granted a substantial pension as a token of gratitude for her service. In 1212, when he attained the age of 5, Henry's formal education was entrusted to the Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, an arrangement that would endure for the majority of the ensuing decade. Desroches was demonstrably a judicious choice, and by the time Henry reached the age of 9, he was reputed to be an individual who articulated himself with a certain gravitas and had been imbued with a deep respect for his Angevin ancestors, a characteristic deemed indispensable for a personage whose ordained duty would be to uphold the eminence of the royal lineage. Furthermore, it is probable that Henry's tutelage under Desroches was instrumental in fostering the piety and religious inclinations that would become manifest in his later life. This period of childhood tranquility would soon face disruption, however. A significant portion of Henry's extensive reign was profoundly influenced by the actions of his father. John had ascended to the throne of England in 1199, following years of calculated machinations directed against his own brother, King Richard III. Richard's demise in 1109, devoid of a designated heir, facilitated John's rise to power but proved to be a calamitous event for the royal succession. During the 12th century, the kings of England had exercised dominion over a considerable portion of French territory, most notably the Duchy of Normandy in the northern region of the country, alongside other domains such as the County of Anjou and segments of Gascony and Aquitaine situated in southern and western France. However, when John initiated military conflict with France in 1202, he swiftly succeeded in alienating his French noblemen, and a subsequent series of disastrous military reverses inflicted by King Philip II of France culminated in the forfeiture of a substantial proportion of the royal family's landholdings in northern France, territories that had been integrated with England since the Norman conquest of England in the mid-11th century. The loss of these territories in 1204 represented a significant humiliation for John, and his relationship with his own nobility within England also underwent a period of decline in the ensuing years. Both of these factors, the deteriorating rapport with England's nobility and the loss of significant Angevin territories in France, would cast protracted shadows over the trajectory of Henry's reign. These periods of unrest reached their apex shortly prior to Henry's accession to the kingship of England. In 1214, John was once more engaged in warfare with King Philip II of France. Yet the financial burden associated with attempting to reclaim Normandy and other forfeited territories was effectively being shouldered by the English nobility through the imposition of elevated taxes. Their concerns regarding this fiscal strain were further exacerbated when John's military forces endured a resounding defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in Flanders in July of 1214, effectively nullifying England's prospects of recovering its French possessions. As a direct consequence of these events, a faction of English nobles, under the leadership of Sire de Quincy, the inaugural Earl of Winchester, and Robert Fitzwalter, instigated a rebellion against John, an uprising that subsequently became known as the First Barons' War. Initially, John demonstrated a propensity for conciliation, And on the 15th day of June in 1215, he convened with the leaders of the rebellion at Runnymede, situated near Windsor, and acceded to the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, a seminal document wherein John formally acknowledged both the inherent rights of the lords and the established limitations upon his own royal prerogative to levy taxation and intervene in the affairs of the church and the personal lives of the nobility. Magna Carta has since been historically regarded as a pivotal juncture in the progressive evolution of England's political system, a foundational document that effectively placed constraints upon the expansive authority of the monarchy. However, in the immediate context of the time, it was summarily disregarded by John, who, having initially consented to its provisions, subsequently came to believe that he possessed sufficient military strength to decisively suppress the revolt through armed force. An exceedingly anomalous situation then began to unfold. For successive decades, the kings of France had been consistently compelled to contend with England's persistent interference in French domestic affairs. Now, in a notable reversal of historical precedent, France would directly intervene within England itself, as the English barons dispatched formal petitions to Prince Louis, the son of King Philip of France, earnestly soliciting French military support in their ongoing struggle against John. Louis promptly initiated a military invasion of England in the early summer of 1216. John, demonstrably seized by panic, precipitously fled to Winchester, effectively leaving the city of London largely undefended and vulnerable to occupation by Louis's invading armies. Subsequently, the French prince was even formally proclaimed as the rightful king of England by the assembled English rebels. Throughout the ensuing weeks, the overall situation became progressively precarious for John, and by necessary extension, for his young heir, Henry. However, John then succumbed to a severe bout of dysentery and ultimately died in October of 1216. In a sudden and unforeseen reversal of allegiances, the English nobles who had previously been in open rebellion against John abruptly abandoned their support for Prince Louis and commenced transferring their fealty to the young Henry. Thus it came to pass that John's son, who had recently celebrated his 9th birthday mere days before his father's untimely death, ascended to the throne as the King of England. John's death precipitated a significant shift in the prevailing political landscape, creating a novel opportunity for the English barons and nobles to reconcile their differences with the crown. While Prince Louis suddenly found himself in a position of marked isolation, abandoned by the very individuals who, just weeks prior, had been actively advocating for his coronation as the King of England. As a sovereign of tender years, Henry, being a mere 9-year-old child, was patently incapable of exercising effective royal governance in his own right in 1216, nor would this incapacity be rectified for a considerable duration. Instead, a formal regency government was expeditiously established to administer the affairs of state on his behalf. There then ensued 2 military victories of considerable import. In mid-May, Marshall orchestrated a decisive triumph over French military forces at the Battle of Lincoln, while in late August, an English naval fleet under the able command of Hubert de Burgh successfully defeated the French Navy in a crucial maritime engagement. With sustained military and logistical support from France now largely interdicted, Louis ultimately acceded to the imperative of engaging in formal peace negotiations. Through the Treaty of Lambeth, formally concluded in September of 1217, Louis explicitly agreed to renounce his previously asserted claims to the English throne in return for a substantial financial indemnity, while Henry's regency government broadly consented to duly implement and fully honor the substantive provisions of Magna Carta. With the formalization of this treaty, the protracted and destabilizing First Barons' War was finally brought to a definitive conclusion, thereby effectively stabilizing Henry's nascent reign after the protracted period of political chaos directly engendered by the policies and actions of his father. A substantial volume of administrative and political remediation work now urgently needed to be undertaken by Marshall and the other senior figures comprising the Regency government, primarily focusing on the critical tasks of systematically restoring the preeminence of the royal prerogative throughout England and incrementally strengthening the authority of the crown, with the overarching strategic objective of effectively reasserting its historically diminished political and military position within France in the ensuing years. While the seminal events of 1217 had successfully terminated the widespread armed revolt of Henry's nobles, they nonetheless remained a fractious and inherently difficult constituency to effectively control, being acutely cognizant of the Regency government's manifest political and fiscal vulnerabilities. Moreover, Marshall's regency administration was demonstrably operating under conditions of acute financial stringency and was also simultaneously confronting a persistent state of civil unrest within Wales, where Prince Llewellyn of Gwynedd had accrued a considerable degree of political autonomy over the country during the protracted period of turbulence associated with the First Barons' War. In a concerted effort to effectively assuage the latter pressing issue of Welsh autonomy, the Treaty of Worcester was diligently negotiated with Llewellyn in 1218, whereby the Welsh prince was formally recognized in his de facto possession of certain territories he had effectively claimed and controlled in years past. While not representing an ideal or comprehensive resolution to the complex Welsh question, this treaty nonetheless served to pacify Wales, thereby enabling the Crown to more effectively concentrate its limited resources on systematically restoring its diminished authority throughout England. With this primary strategic objective substantially achieved, Marshall had at least successfully terminated the most immediate and pressing armed conflicts directly confronting his young king, but it would predictably necessitate a protracted period of sustained administrative and political effort for the English crown to comprehensively regain a position of robust and unassailable strength. The definitive securing of this overarching objective of political and economic stability was destined to be Marshall's final significant achievement, as he died on May 14, 1219. The critical issue of the future composition and operational modalities of the Regency government was subsequently and extensively debated at a formal conference meticulously convened at Oxford just weeks following Marshall's untimely death. At this important convocation, it was formally determined that a triumvirate of senior individuals would collectively assume the responsibilities of governance. Peter de Roche, by virtue of his established role as Henry's personal tutor, was slated to play a prominent and influential role within this tripartite arrangement, as would Pandolf Verraccio, the duly appointed papal legate to England. However, the demonstrably preeminent figure within this regency administration, emerging from 1219 onwards, was the justiciar Hubert de Burgh. In the ensuing years, de Burgh progressively commenced a systematic consolidation of ever greater increments of governmental authority until by 1222 he demonstrably stood as the largely unrivaled head of the extant regency administration. His tenure in this position also proved to be remarkably successful and productive. By the definitive close of 1223, he had effectively managed to retake a substantial portion of Llewellyn's previously claimed territories within Wales, thereby systematically re-establishing the formal exercise of crown authority throughout the region, while he was also demonstrably successful in initiating the implementation of new crown taxation measures during the mid-1220s, carefully calibrated fiscal policies that commenced the gradual but perceptible restoration of the crown's long-depleted financial resources, although it predictably remained substantially beholden to the financial and political influence of the English nobility in this critical regard. Finally, in 1226, de Burgh resolutely embarked upon the protracted and demonstrably arduous undertaking of attempting to reclaim a meaningful portion of the extensive English territories in France that John had definitively forfeited 2 decades prior. In that same year, a strategically planned English military expedition successfully recaptured the historically significant province of Gascony, situated in the southwestern region of France. By this juncture, Henry was rapidly approaching the definitive culmination of his formative teenage years. Consequently, on January 8, 1227, a mere 3 months after formally attaining the age of 19 years, he meticulously convened a formal council of the assembled English nobility and his senior royal officials at Oxford. Indeed, the young king publicly acknowledged the paramount political preeminence of de Burgh among his royal subjects by formally elevating him to the peerage, creating him the inaugural Earl of Kent in a formal ceremony conducted very soon after the Oxford Council. Subsequently, in April of 1228, de Burgh was further granted the esteemed office of Justiciar for life, a demonstrably peculiar and unprecedented arrangement that implicitly highlighted the persistently circumscribed nature of the young king's de facto political authority at this relatively early stage of his personal reign. In the final analysis, what would ultimately and irrevocably commence to weaken Hubert's previously unassailable political position was not any concerted or decisive action directly initiated by Henry himself, but rather the strategically consequential return of Peter de Roche, Henry's childhood tutor, to England following a protracted absence of several years in the Holy Land, where he had participated as a prominent figure in the Sixth Crusade. The strategically significant return of Desroches to England in 1231 precipitated a dramatic and largely unforeseen realignment of the prevailing power dynamics within Henry's royal court. In January of 1232, Desroches was formally appointed as a Baron of the Exchequer, thereby strategically placing him in direct control of a substantial portion of the fiscal administration of the kingdom. Leveraging this newly acquired and considerable authority, he was able to systematically commence undermining de Burgh's previously unchallenged political ascendancy, and in particular to effectively curtail de Burgh's capacity to levy taxation for the financing of a renewed military campaign in France. Subsequently, in June of the same year, Desroches' close relative, Peter de Rivalis, was appointed to the esteemed position of treasurer of Henry's royal household. April 1228, de Burgh was granted the office of justiciar for life, a peculiar arrangement underscoring the young king's persistently limited political authority. By 1229, nascent indications suggested Henry was endeavoring to assert his autonomy from his former regent. However, even Hubert's demonstrable mishandling of a military campaign in France, aimed at reclaiming Normandy in the late 1220s, failed to compel Henry to effect a definitive break with de Burgh. Ultimately, the catalyst that initiated the erosion of Hubert's once unassailable position was not any concerted action undertaken by Henry himself, but rather the return of Peter de Roche, Henry's childhood tutor, to England following a prolonged absence of several years in the Holy Land as a participant in the Sixth Crusade. The strategically significant return of de Roche to England in 1231 engendered a dramatic realignment of power dynamics within Henry's royal court. In January 1232, de Roche was formally appointed as a Baron of the Exchequer, thereby strategically positioning him to oversee a substantial portion of the kingdom's financial administration. Capitalizing upon this newly acquired authority, he was able to commence a systematic undermining of de Burgh's previously unchallenged political preeminence, and, more specifically, to effectively curtail de Burgh's capacity to levy taxes for a renewed military expedition into France. Subsequently, in June, de Roche's kinsman, Peter de Rivalis, was appointed to the esteemed office of treasurer of Henry's household. This sequence of appointments served as an unambiguous indication that de Roche's faction was gaining ascendancy. While de Burgh's influence was demonstrably waning, it could scarcely have surprised many observers when merely weeks later, in July 1232, Henry definitively severed ties with de Burgh amidst swirling rumors alleging the justiciar's intention to improperly interfere in ecclesiastical affairs. Yet despite Henry's maturation, nearing his 25th year, well past the opportune juncture for him to fully assert his royal prerogative, the removal of de Burgh in the summer of 1232 did not immediately precipitate Henry's assumption of direct personal rule. Rather, the events of 1232 simply resulted in the ascendance of a new government dominated by de Roche and his affiliated faction. This prevailing state of affairs would endure for a biennium, and it was only in the summer of 1234, following earnest entreaties from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund of Abingdon, urging the king to terminate his reliance upon powerful advisors, that Henry mustered sufficient resolve to dismiss de Roche and dismantle his faction's dominance at court. Finally, at the age of 26, Henry III would commence to govern in his own right. One of the initial matters necessitating resolution at this juncture was Henry's continued bachelor status. Various marital negotiations had been conducted since the late 1220s, yet none had culminated in a formal betrothal. It was, by several metrics, a curious match. Given her tender age, several years would necessarily elapse before Eleanor could potentially bear Henry an heir, while her father was not a particularly wealthy French lord, and the dowry accompanying the marriage was comparatively modest. However, the Provençal alliance did furnish tangible diplomatic advantages, as Raymond controlled strategically vital passes across the Alps, facilitating transit between southern France and northern Italy, while Eleanor's elder sister was married to King Louis IX of France. The union consequently served to solidify a more robust peace treaty with Louis, who now became Henry's brother-in-law. Henry and Eleanor were formally married at Westminster on January 20th, 1236. Despite their age disparity, their relationship would, in time, evolve into one characterized by genuine affection, although it was not devoid of its inherent challenges. Eleanor arrived in England accompanied by her own retinue of individuals hailing from southern France. One of these, William of Savoy, swiftly ascended to a position of influence as a government minister, and resentment began to percolate among the English nobility in the ensuing years regarding the perceived undue influence of the French faction within Henry's court. However, there was demonstrably no recurrence of the factional dominance that Desroches had wielded in the early 1230s. Perhaps more significantly, the marriage soon proved fruitful, yielding children and a designated heir. In the summer of 1239, Henry and Eleanor's first child, the future King Edward I, was born. Two daughters, Margaret and Beatrice, followed in rapid succession in 1240 and 1242, before a second son, Edmund, arrived in 1245. A fifth and final child, Catherine, was born many years later in 1253. However, she suffered from an ailment, the precise nature of which remains unclear, and died at the tender age of 3. The surviving children, as will be elaborated upon, would subsequently play significant roles in English political affairs throughout the latter portion of Henry's reign. The altered circumstances prevailing in the mid to late 1230s also witnessed the emergence of a discernibly transformed royal court. In addition to the influx of numerous French officials as part of Eleanor's household retinue, Henry commenced promoting a new cohort of courtiers who lacked prior affiliations with the erstwhile factions of de Burgh and Desroches, and with whom he could effect a clean break from past political alignments. These figures included individuals such as William de Cantilupe, the second Baron of Eaton Bray, whom Henry appointed as Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, Sir Bertram de Creole, who served as Warden of the Cinque Ports and Keeper of Dover Castle from the mid-1230s onwards, and Sir John Monsell, who ultimately ascended to the position of Lord Chancellor. A position of prominence was also accorded to Edmund, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had earnestly implored the king to sever his reliance upon Desroches some years prior. Nevertheless, keen to definitively eliminate any residual factionalism within the court, Henry eventually extended pardons to both Desroches and de Burgh in 1238 and 1243, respectively, prior to their deaths, and systematically rehabilitated some of their former associates in the years that followed. In this strategic manner, Henry effectively neutralized several potential sources of opposition and cultivated a more stable courtly environment throughout the 1230s and early 1240s, wherein no individual wielded greater political influence than the king himself. The initial years of Henry's direct personal rule also witnessed the negotiation of a highly significant agreement between England and Scotland. Successive kings of England, extending back to William the Conqueror and indeed continuing beyond Henry's reign, well into the mid-16th century, had frequently engaged in armed conflict with England's northern neighbor. Henry, however, adopted a markedly different approach. The King of Scotland, Alexander II, had entered into matrimony with Henry's sister Joan in 1221. Eager to capitalize upon the opportunities afforded by this familial alliance, in early 1237, Henry instructed his royal officials to organize a formal meeting with Alexander at York, situated in the north of England. There, on September 25, 1237, a mutually beneficial agreement known as the Treaty of York was finalized. This treaty definitively demarcated the border between England and Scotland, with Alexander formally relinquishing any extant claims that the Scottish throne had previously asserted to the counties of Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. Richard of Cornwall demonstrably resented his diminished role in political affairs following the arrival of the French coterie surrounding Eleanor in the mid-1230s. He had attempted to instigate unrest among the English nobility during this period. Nevertheless, within a year, Richard was once again making manifest his dissatisfaction with the prevailing course of events. The specific issue that now provoked his ire was the revelation that Simon de Montfort, a French-born courtier, had commenced a clandestine romantic relationship with Henry and Richard's widowed sister, Eleanor. Henry's initial response upon discovering this clandestine liaison was to attempt to mitigate the potential scandal by arranging a secret marriage between Simon and Eleanor in January 1238. However, Richard proved unwilling to countenance this development and perceived de Montfort's marriage to Eleanor as indicative of the emergence of a new dominant faction at court, ostensibly headed by French figures such as Simon and William of Savoy. While his assessment of the influence of the French faction was arguably overstated, the practical outcome remained the same. In the spring of 1238, Henry was confronted with a fresh rebellion, this time spearheaded by his own brother. The rebellion of 1238 swiftly garnered the support of several other prominent English nobles, Most notably Gilbert Marshall, the fourth Earl of Pembroke and son of Henry's former guardian, William Marshall, and Robert de Quincey, the second Earl of Winchester. They succeeded in mobilizing considerable support by arguing to the broader political community that the marriage of the king's sister to a French newcomer should not have been conducted clandestinely without prior consultation with the leading magnates of England. It is also crucial to recall that this occurred at a historical juncture when Henry did not, as yet, have a designated heir, thereby rendering any marriage involving a member of the royal family a matter of considerable political import. Henry met Richard and his assembled adherents in arms at Stratford-le-Bow, situated just outside London, in late February, but opted to refrain from engaging in direct military confrontation, instead withdrawing to the relative security of the Tower of London. Political acumen, rather than armed force, ultimately proved instrumental in diffusing the volatile situation. Richard had long expressed a fervent desire to lead a crusade to the Holy Land, emulating his and Henry's renowned uncle, Richard the Lionheart, and Henry now provided him with a substantial sum of 16,000 marks to finance this undertaking. Consequently, in 1240, Richard departed for the Holy Land, where his sole notable achievement was the refortification of Ascalon for the benefit of the Christian cause. Concurrently, William of Savoy departed for the continent in the early summer of 1238, and notably never returned to England, thereby effectively alleviating much of the prevailing unease regarding the perceived growing influence of the Queen's French advisors at Henry's court. In the ensuing years, the Jewish community of England became a matter of increasing concern and preoccupation at court. As was the prevailing pattern elsewhere in medieval Europe, the Jewish population in England constituted a demonstrably marginalized and oppressed segment of society. Within the prevailing Christian worldview of the era, this societal marginalization was often rationalized as justifiable retribution, predicated upon the theological belief that the Jewish people had collectively committed deicide, the act of killing God in their perceived role in instigating Jesus' crucifixion by the Roman authorities in the days preceding his death and resurrection. Thus, in marked contrast to modern iterations of anti-Semitism, which have typically gravitated towards elaborate conspiracy theories positing Jewish attempts to exert clandestine control over society, medieval anti-Semitism was more fundamentally rooted in specific interpretations of the New Testament. Communities of Jewish settlers had first established a presence in England during the 11th century and had intermittently experienced periods of persecution throughout the 12th century. However, given the chronically precarious financial position of the crown during the early 13th century, the royal administration had implemented a series of policies demonstrably intended to benefit the Jewish population, who occupied a disproportionately significant role in moneylending, as Judaism did not prescribe the practice of usury, in contradistinction to prevailing Christian doctrine. Henry continued these established policies throughout the 1230s and 1240s, but he also concurrently endeavored to cultivate a policy actively seeking to convert England's Jewish population to Roman Catholicism. Through the establishment and sustained royal patronage of the Domus Conversorum in London, literally signifying the House of the Converts, it is estimated that as much as 10% of the Jewish population in England had undergone formal conversion to Christianity by the 1250s, but the Crown's policies pertaining to the Jewish community, as will be subsequently elaborated upon, became markedly more hostile during the latter portion of Henry's reign. Henry's strategic approach towards Wales during the early years of his personal rule was substantially shaped by the death of Prince Llywelyn there in 1240. Deprived of its most formidable leader, the Welsh nobility exhibited diminished coordination in resisting English incursions in the years that followed, and three distinct military campaigns undertaken throughout the 1240s enabled Henry to re-establish English dominion over the country to an extent that had not been feasible for much of the 13th century up to that juncture. In particular, northern Wales was brought firmly under Henry's jurisdiction through the strategic expansion of the county of Chester along its eastern border and the construction of a network of new fortifications and castles across the northern terrain. Henry's mother, Isabella, remained a youthful woman at the time of John the First's death in 1216, and in 1220 she entered into matrimony with Hugh of Lusignan, the Count of La Marche in northern France. Hugh was a vassal of King Louis IX of France, but in 1242 he and several other French noblemen initiated a rebellion against the French monarch and his brother Alphonse, who held the county of Poitou. Henry now aligned himself with these French lords of Poitou and the surrounding region, engaging in warfare against the French crown in a brief conflict historically known as the Saintonge War. However, the military campaign into France rapidly devolved into a disaster for Henry. At the Battle of Taillebourg in July 1242, the king and his Poitevin allies found themselves encircled by French forces, and Henry's escape was only secured through the intervention of his brother Richard, who managed to negotiate a day's respite from hostilities, leveraging his recent return from a crusade to the Holy Land. This military setback effectively enabled Louis to decisively suppress the rebellion in Poitou, while Henry retreated back to England, having expended a staggering $80,000 on a futile campaign that served only to incite the animosity of certain members of his court, chief among whom was the French-born Simon de Montfort. The military reverses sustained during the Saintonge War were not rectified in subsequent years in France. The substantial financial resources that Henry had squandered in his abortive attempt to support the rebels in Poitou precluded him from adopting a more proactive strategy aimed at recovering his French territories for much of the 1240s. Moreover, King Louis of France emerged as one of the most formidable rulers of his kingdom in decades. Consequently, the remaining years of the 1240s witnessed a further erosion of Henry's influence among the Lusignans of Poitou and La Marche, as Louis progressively extended his dominion over their region of the country. A considerable number of these Lusignan nobles subsequently relocated to England, where Henry rewarded them with grants of land and fortified castles. This influx of French nobles predictably engendered resentment among established courtiers in England, who harbored suspicions regarding the purported undue influence of the Poitevin faction. Concurrently, Henry endeavored to employ diplomacy to bolster his strategic position vis-à-vis France, cultivating an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, in the mid-1240s, in the optimistic hope that the German monarch might exert pressure upon Louis to facilitate the restitution of some of England's former territorial possessions. This diplomatic aspiration ultimately proved to be wishful thinking, and by the close of the 1240s, Henry's overall strategic position in France was demonstrably no more advantageous than it had been for England at the height of the protracted crisis under his father's reign. Thus the question arises, what manner of man had Henry III become, having emerged as the effective king of England in his own right by the 1240s, following a protracted period spent in the shadow of the Regency government and influential figures such as Desroches? Contemporary descriptive accounts of Henry's physical appearance are conspicuously absent, an omission that might reasonably suggest that there was nothing particularly remarkable or distinctive about his physical features to warrant specific mention. Subsequent examination of his skeletal remains in the 19th century indicated that he stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches in height, which was considered average for the period, and possessed a robust physique. Numerous contemporary observers characterize Henry as a man of simple tastes, almost verging on naivete in certain respects, yet demonstrably lacking the pronounced character flaws that had plagued his father and engendered so many crises at the outset of the 13th century. In marked contrast to many of his predecessors and successors as King of England, he was by inclination a largely pacific ruler, one who, while not entirely averse to military conflict, certainly did not actively seek or revel in warfare. Indeed, the king's widespread reputation for possessing a sanguine and uncomplicated disposition extended far beyond the confines of his own kingdom, and we even find the renowned Tuscan poet Dante Alighieri alluding to this very characteristic in his celebrated literary works. Yet Henry's inherent sanguinity was not without its potential pitfalls, and there is little doubt that the protracted duration of his assumption of personal rule was, at least in part, attributable to his excessively modest temperament and his pronounced desire to accommodate the wishes and expectations of others. Henry was demonstrably a deeply religious man and accordingly extended considerable patronage to the church. His contemporary, the Benedictine chronicler Matthew Paris, recounted that the king observed numerous religious festivals with exceptional piety, frequently fasting on bread and water and adorning himself in simple woolen garments. Moreover, he harbored a particular fondness for undertaking pilgrimages to some of England's most venerated religious sites, such as Walsingham and St. Albans. During the 1240s, he was reputed to have provided charitable sustenance to upwards of 500 impoverished individuals on a daily basis, while also consistently providing for orphans and making substantial donations to England's various religious houses, specifically earmarked for the construction of hospitals and other charitable institutions. Indeed, it has been persuasively argued that Henry was arguably the most munificent patron of the mendicant friars in late medieval England. Henry also stands as a noteworthy contributor to England's rich cultural heritage. Within the realm of literature, his personal predilections tended towards the comparatively unpretentious. For instance, extant financial records from the period reveal that his preferred reading material consisted of a great book of romances. Moreover, while his reign witnessed the emergence of numerous prominent medieval English intellectuals, among whom the Franciscan philosopher and proto-scientist Roger Bacon is particularly noteworthy, Henry was not, by comparison, a major patron of such intellectual figures. However, his influence upon the arts and architecture was demonstrably considerable. For example, he oversaw significant enhancements to the Tower of London, even introducing an early menagerie, or zoological garden, complete with exotic fauna including an elephant, leopard, and camel. He also directed the most substantial phase of development at Windsor Castle prior to the decade of the 1250s also witnessed a discernible shift in Henry's strategic approach towards the Jewish community of England. As previously noted, Henry's government had, in earlier decades, attempted to implement a policy of conversion targeting the Jewish population in the 1230s, but this initial policy was largely predicated upon persuasion and voluntary adherence, motivated, at least in Henry's case, by his deeply held personal piety. He appears to have genuinely believed that he was divinely obligated to redeem the Jewish people of England from eternal damnation by facilitating their conversion from what he perceived as a misguided religious faith. In marked contrast, the 1250s witnessed the adoption of a demonstrably more coercive strategic approach to conversion. In 1253, the Statute of Jewry was formally promulgated. This legislative enactment introduced a series of restrictive measures specifically designed to impede the open practice of Judaism within England. For instance, it was henceforth decreed that no new synagogues could be constructed anywhere within the realm. Jewish individuals were also legally mandated to reside exclusively within designated communities or ghettos, and were further compelled to wear distinctive badges of identification in public to readily signify their Jewish religious affiliation. Other provisions of the statute were explicitly intended to compel Jews to conform to normative Christian social practices. For example, by legally prescribing the consumption of meat by Jews during the season of Lent. Thus, the decade of the 1250s witnessed a discernible escalation in the systematic persecution of England's Jewish population, a trend that would inexorably culminate in their eventual wholesale expulsion from the country during the subsequent reign of Edward I. Mere months following the legislative enactment of the Statute of Jewry, a revised strategic approach was also adopted towards Ireland. The English presence in Ireland by this historical juncture extended back nearly a century, the initial phase of the protracted conquest of the island from its numerous independent Irish lords having been commenced by Henry's grandfather, Henry II, in the 1170s. By the mid-13th century, a substantial portion of the island had been brought under English dominion, although significant swathes of Ulster in the north, Connaught in the west, and Munster in the south remained firmly under the control of indigenous Irish lords. In 1254, Henry made the strategically significant decision to formally grant his eldest son and designated heir presumptive Edward the prestigious title of Lord of Ireland, explicitly stipulating, however, that the Irish territories would not be juridically separated from the Crown's English dominions, but rather remain perpetually appurtenant to them. Thereafter, the English presence within Ireland continued to expand incrementally, as ambitious adventurers such as John Fitzthomas, the inaugural Baron of Desmond, made substantial inroads in acquiring extensive landholdings from the powerful MacCarthy dynasty of Munster. As a direct consequence of these developments, by the definitive close of Henry's reign, the English lordship in Ireland was demonstrably approaching its historical zenith, and the period encompassing Henry's reign and those of his immediate successors constitutes one of the comparatively rare historical junctures in England's tortuous and often fraught entanglement with Ireland, wherein the English exchequer actually derived a net fiscal benefit from Ireland, rather than consistently having to dispatch financial subsidies to Dublin. When meticulously managed and efficiently implemented, such large-scale recoinage operations whether in the medieval or early modern periods, could predictably generate a substantial financial windfall for the governing administration, and the recoinage of 1247 proved to be no exception to this established historical pattern. Building upon this fiscal success, Henry, whose own personal financial circumstances had remained demonstrably precarious throughout the regency governments of his youth, was widely believed to have accumulated a substantial stockpile of readily available capital to draw upon, should unforeseen exigencies arise. A prudent financial reserve that would soon prove to be critically necessary when fresh political crises began to emerge towards the latter portion of the 1250s. However, a subsequent initiative to introduce further fiscal innovation in 1257 through the minting of gold pennies, a form of coinage then gaining widespread popularity in the bustling Mediterranean trading ports of Venice, Pisa, and Genoa in Italy at the time, ultimately proved to be considerably less successful than the earlier reform of the silver coinage, and was eventually abandoned in the face of sustained objections and complaints emanating from the influential merchant community of the City of London, who vociferously argued that the newly introduced gold coins were demonstrably overvalued in relation to prevailing market conditions. Early in the decade of the 1250s, Henry became deeply embroiled in the intricate political machinations of the Kingdom of Sicily, located in southern Italy. This geographically strategic region of Italy had been initially conquered by Norman military forces during the course of the 11th and early 12th centuries, but had subsequently passed into the possession of the Hohenstaufen royal lineage of Germany in the late 12th century. As a direct consequence of this dynastic succession, the long-reigning Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, had effectively ruled Sicily since 1197, albeit in a demonstrably unstable and contested manner, with both the indigenous Norman aristocracy and the papacy, situated to the north in Rome, persistently intervening in Sicilian domestic affairs. Rome, in particular, harbored long-standing anxieties and strategic aspirations to augment its political and ecclesiastical influence throughout southern Italy, especially at a historical juncture when it was engaged in recurrent and often acrimonious conflicts with the formidable Hohenstaufen dynasty, given their substantial political and military preeminence throughout Germany. Consequently, upon Frederick II's death in 1250, the Pope in Rome, Innocent IV, strategically moved to obstruct the potential accession of a new Hohenstaufen candidate to the Sicilian throne, and commenced actively seeking a more pliant and amenable ruler who would consistently defer to papal authority in matters pertaining to the governance of Sicily. He swiftly concluded that Henry's younger son, Edmund, would constitute an ideal candidate for this role, and Henry himself proved amenable to proceeding with this ambitious plan, viewing Sicily as a strategically advantageous base from which he could finally realize his long-held aspiration to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. Emulating the illustrious example of his uncle Richard the Lionheart, whose military exploits in the late 12th century had become the stuff of legend. After years of protracted and often Byzantine negotiations, Edmund was at last formally dispatched to Italy in 1254 and was subsequently invested as King of Sicily by Pope Alexander IV, who had ascended to the papal tiara in December of 1254, succeeding Innocent IV. Thereafter, Edmund commenced concerted efforts to dislodge the Hohenstaufen claimant, Manfred, from the Kingdom of Sicily and effectively assert his own tenuous claim to the throne. Yet this ambitious undertaking soon encountered formidable obstacles. While Pope Innocent IV had previously extended substantial loans to Henry, ostensibly to aid him in raising a military force capable of supporting Edmund's claim, Alexander IV, his papal successor, adopted a markedly more fiscally conservative stance, and within mere months of his own papal accession, was actively demanding that Henry commence repaying the considerable sums that Innocent had previously loaned to him. However, Henry, whose reign remained persistently encumbered by chronic financial difficulties, proved demonstrably unable to repay anything approximating the staggering sum of $90,000 that Alexander was now aggressively demanding. The financially beleaguered king then turned to the English Parliament, earnestly soliciting parliamentary financial assistance. However, his entreaties were resoundingly rebuffed, and he ultimately proved capable of amassing only approximately $40,000 through the politically contentious expedient of reappropriating a substantial portion of the English Church's existing revenues throughout the mid-1250s. with Alexander pointedly threatening ecclesiastical excommunication should Henry fail to remit full repayment of the outstanding papal loans. The ambitious endeavor to militarily enforce Edmund's claim to the Sicilian throne was definitively abandoned in 1258, following which Alexander formally revoked the previously granted papal investiture of the kingship of Sicily to Edmund. Thereafter, Manfred was formally crowned as the King of Sicily at Palermo in August, effectively ending Edmund's brief and ill-fated reign in absentia. A growing and increasingly pervasive perception took root among the English aristocracy that Henry was demonstrably reckless and improvident in his personal spending habits, and that this chronic fiscal irresponsibility was systematically weakening the overall financial and political stability of the kingdom. Furthermore, his widely perceived pattern of overt favoritism towards his Lusignan relatives hailing from Poitou continued to stir up profound resentment and animosity among his native English subjects. This simmering undercurrent of widespread disillusionment and aristocratic discontent finally boiled over into overt political opposition in 1258, spearheaded by the English barons and certain influential French-born lords, such as Simon de Montfort, who had long regarded England as their adopted homeland. These disaffected nobles, prominently led by de Montfort and Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, convened a pivotal parliament in the summer of 1258. At this politically charged assembly, this organized opposition faction effectively compelled Henry to formally accede to the so-called Provisions of Oxford, a sweeping set of constitutional ordinances through which the Lusignans were effectively and comprehensively removed from all positions of governmental influence, and the administration of the realm was formally vested in the hands of a council of 15 royal advisors who were to be selected directly by the leading magnates and nobles of the kingdom, thereby fundamentally curtailing the king's previously unconstrained royal prerogative. These were further supported by the more extreme Westminster provisions in 1259, which now garnered backing from Prince Edward, Henry's own son and successor. As a consequence of these developments, by the close of the 1250s, Henry had forfeited much of the independent authority he had exercised since the mid-1230s. Thereafter commenced a period of aristocratic governance, during which the English nobility shaped the direction of English policy. Henry did not fully accept this altered state of affairs. Instead, he endeavored to maneuver himself back into a position from which he could challenge his barons. To achieve this, he embarked on a bold initiative regarding France. In late 1259, he and the Queen departed England, making their way to Paris. Henry's objective was to negotiate a peace accord with King Louis, with the aim of finally settling the protracted disagreements concerning their respective domains. Despite its unpopularity within much of the English political establishment, Henry consented to Louis's proposal that he would renounce his claims to the former English territories in northern France, lost by his father half a century prior, most notably the Duchy of Normandy. In return, Louis pledged to recognize Henry as the legitimate ruler of Gascony and the adjacent lands in southwestern France, territories still under English control. Louis also committed to providing Henry with diplomatic and financial aid in his dispute with his nobles back in England. Bolstered by this newfound support from Paris, Henry was able to return to England in 1260, and by the latter part of 1261 he had regained control by capitalizing on divisions that had arisen between de Montfort, de Clare, and Edward. Having accomplished this, de Montfort was banished to France, and the king reconciled with Edward. However, the situation remained unstable, and the potential for renewed unrest seemed ever present. While Henry had reasserted his authority during 1261, the underlying tensions that had sparked the opposition in 1258 largely persisted. The Poitevins continued to wield some influence over the king, and Henry's effective surrender of his claims to England's former possessions in northern France was not welcomed by all of the English barons. Furthermore, while Edward had been brought back into accord with his father, Simon de Montfort remained a problem for Henry, even in exile in France. Consequently, when news arrived in April 1263 that de Montfort had crossed the Channel and returned to England, it caused considerable alarm, particularly as de Montfort had returned at the instigation of a significant portion of the English nobility, who were persuaded that only direct confrontation would induce Henry to change his style of governance. In the ensuing weeks, de Montfort started to assemble a new opposition movement around himself at Oxford. By autumn of that year, armed conflicts were erupting in western England between Henry's adherents and those who sided with de Montfort and the other barons. When de Montfort then marched on London, civil war once again appeared inevitable. The conflict that has become known as the Second Barons' War originated from the events that unfolded in London during the autumn and winter of 1263. Yet de Montfort could not have foreseen what was to transpire. In January 1264, the French king, chosen for the role of arbitrator due to his reputation as a monarch with an inherent sense of justice, issued a ruling known as the Mise of Amiens. In this ruling, he essentially took King Henry's side and proposed the annulment of the prior agreements reached at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259, which had granted the English magnates the power to effectively select Henry's counselors. De Montfort and his followers were now left with only two options: accept defeat or engage in open rebellion. They opted for the latter, and the Second Barons' War began. The ensuing conflict took on many forms. Clashes re-emerged in Western England, while de Montfort began to incite violence against the Jewish community, alleging that many of the financial difficulties experienced across England were due to substantial debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. This inflammatory rhetoric instigated several pogroms against Jewish communities throughout England. However, the central dispute remained between de Montfort and the king. Eventually, the two sides clashed at Lewes in Sussex in mid-May 1264. Here, Henry had established camp at St. Pancras Priory as he awaited further reinforcements to join him. Henry commanded as many as 10,000 men at this location by the time the cavalry detachment under Prince Edward arrived. De Montfort approached Lewes with a smaller force, possibly as few as 5,000 men, but his initial intention was to negotiate with Henry, not to engage in battle. However, when Henry rejected his offer of negotiation, de Montfort launched an attack on the 14th of May. The Royalists initially seemed to be winning the ensuing battle, but an overly zealous pursuit of the baronial army by Edward and his cavalry left Henry and his troops dangerously exposed. Consequently, de Montfort's men succeeded in capturing Henry's brother Richard. Intimidated by this success, Henry effectively surrendered to de Montfort. In the aftermath of Lewes, Henry was compelled to accede to the earlier provisions of Oxford from 1258, which imposed baronial rule. Thus, following this initial phase of the Second Barons' War, Henry was reduced to little more than a symbolic figurehead, with de Montfort in a position of triumph. This state of affairs persisted for the majority of the following year. However, in May 1265, almost exactly a year after the defeat at Lewes, Edward, who was being held in de Montfort's custody, escaped and rapidly began to assemble his own army. A significant victory was achieved early on when he won over Gilbert de Clare, a prominent member of the baronial opposition to the king's cause. On the 1st of August, they attacked de Montfort's troops near Kenilworth Castle. This proved sufficient to compel de Montfort to move to engage Edward. The leader of the baronial movement humiliated the aging king by bringing him along to witness the battle in borrowed armor, but what Henry actually ended up witnessing was the demise of de Montfort's cause. At the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265, Edward's superior forces defeated de Montfort's in Worcestershire. Both de Montfort and his son Henry perished in the fighting, while the king himself was liberated after 15 months of effectively being de Montfort's prisoner. The Battle of Evesham placed the Royalists in a dominant position in the Second Barons' War, although sporadic fighting continued in some regions. To fully resolve it, in 1266 Henry issued the Dictum of Kenilworth, which indicated that former rebels would be treated leniently, while the Statute of Marlborough the following year formalized this agreement and brought the Second Barons' War to a close. The concluding years of Henry's reign, in the wake of the Second Barons' War, mirrored much of his reign, in that Henry exerted his best efforts to stabilize matters in the face of numerous challenges. To the west, Henry's counselors negotiated the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 with Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. Through this treaty, Henry recognized Llywelyn as the Prince of Gwynedd, but Llywelyn agreed to pledge allegiance to the king as his liege lord. It was not an ideal arrangement from the English viewpoint, but it brought stability to the western border for several years prior to a resurgence of English power there in the subsequent reign. Within England itself, brigandage and lawlessness were prevalent in many parts of the country in the late 1260s, which Henry's officials endeavored to suppress, although their resources were limited as Henry was still working to repay the debts he had accumulated in fighting the war with de Montfort. On the financial front, the king's situation was complicated by Edward's decision in 1268 to lead the Ninth Crusade to the Holy Land, an undertaking that necessitated further taxes to be levied from a nation that had been unwilling to provide them for decades. Similarly, Henry attempted to mitigate the anti-Jewish sentiments that de Montfort had done much to incite, but his efforts in this regard met with limited success. There was one noteworthy occasion that Henry could cherish in his final years. Work on expanding and redeveloping Westminster had commenced decades earlier, when Henry was a young man. Now, in late 1269, the work there was officially recognized when Henry presided over a grand celebration in which the relics of St. Edward were carried to the shrine at Westminster. For Henry, whose piety and religious devotion were undeniably genuine, it was surely a personal highlight. Shortly afterwards, he saw his son Edward depart to undertake the crusade that Henry himself had intended to embark on numerous times but had never managed to. It was the last time he would see his son. In March 1271, Henry, who was 63 years old and entering old age by the standards of the time, became gravely ill. He recovered sufficiently to govern in some capacity for the following year and a half. Henry passed away at Westminster on the 16th of November, 1272, shortly after his 65th birthday. He was interred at Westminster, although he was re-entombed in 1290 by Edward in a more magnificent tomb at the Abbey. Although Eleanor desired his canonization, it never occurred, but the magnificent structure of Westminster Abbey today stands as a testament to him. Henry was succeeded by his son and long-serving heir, Prince Edward, who now became King Edward I. Despite his waywardness in the late 1250s, Edward had been steadfast in his support of his father subsequently. He was still engaged in the Ninth Crusade to the Holy Land, the last significant effort to aid the doomed Christian states there, before the fall of their final stronghold at Acre in 1291, when his father fell ill in England. Edward was en route home from the Holy Land in 1272 when he received news of Henry's death. The new king, nicknamed Longshanks due to his height of 6'2", ruled in sharp contrast to his father. Where Henry had sought to avoid war, Edward embraced it, firmly re-establishing Wales under English rule in the late 1270s and into the 1280s. Thereafter, he embarked on attempting to conquer Scotland, completely abandoning Henry's conciliatory approach towards England's northern neighbor. Yet domestically, Edward's policies largely mirrored those of his father. The aim was to continue to restore royal authority following the crises of both Henry's and particularly John's reign. He also went a step further by ordering the complete expulsion of the Jewish community from England in 1290. Thus, Edward's reign constituted both a new direction in the endeavor to expand English control throughout Britain and a continuation and intensification of some of Henry's domestic policies. Despite the length and significance of his reign, Henry III has typically been a marginalized figure in English political history. To some extent, this is attributable to his reign occurring between a number of monarchs who were not necessarily more successful than Henry, but were certainly more flamboyant. For example, Henry's uncle, Richard the Lionheart, had little impact on England itself during his relatively brief reign, but has captured the British public's imagination owing to his role in the Crusades to the Holy Land. Additionally, Henry's own father, John the Martyr, is a very prominent English monarch of the late Middle Ages. But this is primarily because of the deficiencies of his rule, and the fact that his heavy-handedness prompted his nobility to demand the signing of Magna Carta, a pivotal moment in English constitutional and political history. Subsequently, Henry was overshadowed after his reign by that of his son, Edward III, who largely completed the conquest of Wales and temporarily brought Scotland under English rule. Finally, Henry's great-grandson, Edward III, initiated the 100 Years' War with France and is often regarded as one of England's greatest monarchs. Positioned between these rulers, some of them highly successful, some of them deeply flawed, Henry III has largely been overlooked amongst the ranks of England's medieval kings. But how should we evaluate Henry III's reign? There is a compelling argument to be made that it was a disaster. Initially, once he reached adulthood in the 1220s, Henry failed to assert himself for many years and permitted Hubert de Burgh and then Peter de Roche to cultivate their own factions which dominated the government. Moreover, all of these disastrous initiatives incurred vast sums of money for a monarchy that was in a precarious financial position when he became king. Ultimately, his apparent preference for outsiders and his reckless dissipation of funds led many of his own nobles to attempt to drastically curtail his power, a move that ultimately culminated in the Second Barons' War. All of this strongly suggests that Henry's reign was a protracted exercise in failure. John was responsible for that, and in 1259, Henry merely reached an agreement with Louis of France that acknowledged that the French had held those lands for over half a century by that point. In contrast, Henry managed to maintain peace with Scotland throughout his lengthy reign and establish the English-Scottish border in a manner that has largely endured to the present day. There can be no denying that Henry was disastrous when it came to finances, but his shortcomings were not the same as John's. Whereas his father was a repellent figure who generated many of his own problems, Henry was a devout man who wished to spend his time constructing religious buildings and honoring the saints. Confrontation was the last thing he desired. It was simply his misfortune to be King of England for half a century during a period when he simply could not avoid it. What are your thoughts on King Henry III? Is he one of England's most underappreciated monarchs? Please share your views in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.